My name's David Lepofsky. I have very little hair on the top of my head, but that's because I wear so many hats, not because I'm getting older. I am the chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. I've now become the co-chair of Barrier Free Canada, which fights for a Canadians with Disabilities Act. And I am really delighted to have this chance to come and speak with you. There's one thing that binds you all together in this room, aside from the fact that you're very nice people, is that you have a shared desire to make our society a more welcoming place where people with disabilities, and in the case of your organization, people with intellectual disabilities or dual diagnoses, including intellectual disabilities, where they can fully participate. And what I want to do with the time we've got together is to give you some new tools that'll help you do that even better than the excellent work you've been doing up to now. The work that organizations like this one do, your work is often involved in dealing with individuals and helping them tackle individual barriers on their own. Of course, your organization also does advocacy for the broader population of people with intellectual disabilities. I work and have the privilege of serving as the leader of a coalition that works with people with all kinds of disabilities to unite us together to fight in common cause against all the barriers we face. What I'd like to do in the time we've got together is to tell you what we're trying to achieve, how we're doing, and how you can help. 3 questions. And I'm going to start by showing you the single most important weapon in our entire campaign. I'm reaching out, and for those with vision impairments, I'm holding up a pad of paper. I'm going to pass the pad of paper around. If you don't now get email updates from the AODA Alliance, and you'd like to, please print your email address on that pad of paper. Just one page there, just if you want to, if the first person can grab the pad. If you don't get our updates yet and you'd like to, just print your email address clearly and then pass it on, and then you don't need to take up a whole page for each person, just make up a list. And let me tell you what I'm going to do with those names. By the way, if people are watching this on video and you're not here and you don't have my pad of paper, you can send a request to get signed up. I'm going to tell you the email address to write. It's aodafeedback@gmail.com. I'm going to repeat that, aodafeedback@gmail.com. And all you have to put in the subject line is "sign me up," and we'll sign you up. Why is this the most important tool in our campaign? Because we maintain an email update list where we keep our supporters posted on what's going on in our campaign for accessibility in Ontario and what you can do to help. And we also seek your ideas. This isn't just us telling you stuff. We invite you to do the same for us. But when I passed this list around in the past, you were just signing up for Ontario updates, but now you get 2 for the price of 1, and the price of 1 is 0, so it's a good price. We're also going to sign you up for Barrier Free Canada. The AODA Alliance campaigns for full accessibility with the provincial government for what the province can do. Barrier Free Canada is campaigning for a Canadians with Disabilities Act. We don't need one, we need both. So let me tell you how we're doing, what we want, how we're doing, and how you can help. What do we want? So our society is, as you know, full of people with disabilities. Some people say there's 1.8 million of us, whether it's a physical disability like using a wheelchair, or sensory disability, I'm blind, intellectual disability, learning disability, all the different communication disabilities, all the different kinds. But frankly, 1.8 million is not all of us in Ontario. 4 million is not all of us in Canada. Why? Because either everybody right now either has a disability or will get one later. So we are not the minority of some. We are the minority of everybody. And when we fight for full accessibility and inclusion for all people with disabilities, we're not asking people without disabilities, what can you do for us? We're asking our entire society to make sure all of us can take part or all of us will suffer. So we've redefined the game. We're no longer having to go to people without disabilities and say, well, what can you do? I know there's a deficit, I know the economy's bad, we're in a recession, things are terrible, maybe later. No, we don't do that anymore. We go to people without disabilities and we say, you know what? We already got our disability, yours is coming. You don't want to face what we face, so let's fix it now. That's what we do. What's our dream? What's our vision? What's our goal? Well, it's simple. A fully accessible Ontario, and in the case of Barrier-Free Canada, a fully accessible Canada, in which people with all disabilities can take part on a footing of equality. Now, in the old days, we like redefining stuff. So we've redefined who we are, but we've also redefined accessibility. 40 years ago, if you said the word accessibility, it meant ramps. And if I was speaking at an organization from the community living movement, they'd go, this is really good, it ain't us. Can we talk about issues relating to us? But when we started this movement 21 years ago, later this month, and I've had the privilege of being there when we started and serving in a leadership role throughout the whole period. When we started this movement, we decided that accessibility relates to removing and preventing any barriers. Some of those barriers can be physical barriers, like stairs when you need a ramp. Some of those barriers may be information barriers, like bus drivers not calling out route stops so a blind person like me doesn't know where we are, nor do a lot of sighted people when they're on the bus. The barriers we face may be communication barriers, like the lack of sign language interpretation when you go to a major government office for government services. If you're deaf and you need sign language. But some of the barriers we face are also attitudinal barriers. They're as much of a roadblock as steps for someone in a wheelchair. But an attitude that says somebody with an intellectual disability can't do this job, or a court that won't use plain language when it should, when a person with an intellectual disability is involved in the court proceedings as a participant, maybe a witness, maybe a victim, maybe an accused person. The lack of plain language during that court proceeding, that's as much of a barrier as a flight of steps is to somebody using a wheelchair. And when we created the Disability Act movement, what we said is all barriers gotta go, and we want all people with disabilities together fighting for them. Because governments, they like to divide us. They like to say, well, we'd love to give you more Braille, but we're busy with sign language. Or we'd like to do more about attitudinal barriers, but we've got to put our money into those ramps. Well, we shut that one down by saying that we're all in it together. And there is nothing more amazing than having somebody who has no intellectual disability talking about the need for plain language. And there is nothing more amazing than somebody with an intellectual disability who doesn't use Braille, but saying that blind people should be able to get Braille if they need it on their elevator buttons. And there's nothing more amazing than a deaf person who can walk saying, we've got to have ramps instead of stairs. Because it tells people with disabilities that we're all in it together, and it tells government they can't divide us. Our vision, our goal, is a fully accessible Ontario and a fully accessible Canada. And by accessible, we mean one without any of those barriers that I've just described. And that's why this is as important for people with learning disabilities as people with mobility disabilities. This is important for people with autism as for people who are blind. It's as important for people with intellectual disabilities as it is for people who are deaf. We're all in it together. So, that's what we want. How are we doing? Well, let me tell you how we're doing. I'm going to give you the bad news, then the good news, then the bad news, then the good news. Ready? The bad news is we still live in a society full of barriers. There's been some progress, but it seems that as quickly as we fix the old barriers, new ones come along. And the original bad news is that back in the 1970s, for those of you who've been around that long, we used to say our biggest problem are attitudes, so we need to raise awareness and educate people. If we just did that, then they'd get it, they'd do the right thing, and then we could fully participate. Well, the bad news is that didn't work. We did a lot of awareness raising, a lot of public education. Organizations like the Community Living Movement, all sorts of other organizations, self-help movement, consumer movements, they all went out and did all this educating folks. And it didn't work. It helped a bit. It's not the solution. That's not to say we don't need to educate people, but it doesn't solve the problem. Then the good news. The good news is, starting around 21 years ago here in Ontario, a small group of us just down the street at Queen's Park, about 20 of us, got together and decided that what we really need is a new law that will ensure that barriers we face will be removed and new ones will never be created again. Now, those barriers were illegal. They violate the Human Rights Code, and in the case of government, they violate the Charter of Rights. But to use those laws, the Human Rights Code and the Charter of Rights, individuals with disabilities have to sue individually, one barrier at a time, one organization at a time. It's not realistic to expect people with disabilities to do that. Most are poor, most don't have the money to hire lawyers, and if they had the money, they wouldn't want to spend it on lawyers. And I gotta tell you, I know what it's like to fight one of those cases. I've done it. I had to sue the Toronto Transit Commission personally, not once, but twice. Once to force them to announce subway stops, and when I won that, a second time to force them to announce bus stops. And it took years. It's a lot of work. They fought really hard. The TTC, I actually brought up Freedom of Information request. I got their legal bills. They spent $450,000 on lawyers opposing my request that they reliably announce all bus and subway stops. And I'm not saying everybody's going to spend that kind of money against you, but people shouldn't have to go up against those fights. I'm a lawyer. I know what it's like. It's not fun. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. So we wanted a new law that would tear down the barriers we face and prevent new ones, but where we don't have to individually sue one barrier at a time. And the good news is that we fought for 10 long years from 1994, and we won that law here in Ontario. It was passed in 2005. It's called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. It requires Ontario to become fully accessible, and that doesn't mean just ramps. It means all the barriers we talked about have got to go, and they got to go within 20 years. But it's not just that the law was an expression of nice feelings. Let's just say they'll all go away in 20 years. It's easy for politicians to do that. They won't be in the legislature in 20 years to face the consequences of what they voted for. No, it goes further, because it puts someone in charge. Someone in charge of leading Ontario to become fully accessible. Who's that someone? The Government of Ontario. The government isn't expected to go out and fix every barrier itself and pay for it in every business, in every store, and so on. No, the way the government's supposed to do it is it's got to do two things. And we invented these two things. They got it from us. First, the government has to create these laws. They're called accessibility standards. And they tell organizations exactly what they got to do and when they got to do it by. The government has to develop these standards by consulting with us. That's the first thing they got to do. And then after they pass them, they got to enforce them. And they got to enforce them effectively. That's what we want. And I'm going to finish this good news with more good news. Excuse me. The Ontario government can do that for a lot of things. Schools, public transit, jobs, and local businesses and stuff. But there's some things that the Ontario government can't regulate. Can't regulate the federal government, banks, airlines, airports, stuff like that. So we need a national law, a Canadians with Disabilities Act, in order to get us solutions for those barriers too. And the good news is that in the last federal election, just a couple months ago, we formed this new coalition, Barrier Free Canada. We fought to get all the political parties to make a promise of a Canadians with Disabilities Act. Two of the parties made the pledge. One is the New Democrats, and the other is Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. The new Liberal government has promised a Canadians with Disabilities Act. We won that during the election. Media didn't cover it much. You may not have heard much about it, but we won it. Now, there's a lot of work ahead to get them to write it, pass it. They've appointed a minister with lead responsibility for it. She's called the Minister for People with Disabilities. We don't have one of those in Ontario, but now we have one nationally. And the woman they appointed, her name is Carla Qualtrough. I haven't met her yet, but she's a visually impaired lawyer. I have this thing about liking to work with visually impaired lawyers, because I'm a visually impaired lawyer. I'm really looking forward to meeting her. So that's all the good news. Moreover, Manitoba passed an accessibility law in 2013, and just 1 month ago, in October of 2015, I had the privilege of being there when a new group in British Columbia formed called Barrier Free British Columbia. The Nova Scotia government has promised a Disabilities Act. They're working on it. The BC government hasn't decided if they're going to do it yet, but we got a community group now that's formed out there. I shouldn't say we, they do. Our community does. And they're hard at work working on it right now. So that's all the good news. So I said, but what about the bad news? Well, the bad news is this. 10 years after the Ontario government passed the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, we've made some progress, but nowhere near enough progress. How do we know that? Well, we know that two ways. First, if you have any disability and you live in Ontario, you still face far too many barriers. And the improvements aren't happening as quickly as they should. We are not on schedule for full accessibility by 2025. We also know that a second way, and that is, under the Disabilities Act, the government had to appoint an independent person every few years to review how we're doing and write a report. They've had two of them, one in 2010, one last year. Both of them have shown that we're not making enough progress, that we're not on schedule for full accessibility, that the government needs to do more. And the most recent report last year pointed specifically to our Premier, Premier Kathleen Wynne, and said she has to show new leadership on this issue. It's pretty strong medicine. So I'll give you some examples. If you work with people with intellectual disabilities, you'll know that there are barriers in the workplace and in our education system. What's the government done about it? Well, they passed an employment accessibility standard, but it doesn't really address the full range of barriers we need fixed. 2.5 years ago, when Kathleen Wynne became our new premier, the government had what they call a throne speech. That's when they announced their priorities. They announced that they were going to make a new priority about creating more job opportunities for people with disabilities. That sounded good. It took them a year to appoint a committee to that they would ask to write a report about what to do. It took a year just to set up a committee. That committee didn't report for another year. The government sat on the report of that committee for 3 or 4 months. And so far from what we've seen, it's really not following the advice they were given. They promised some new action, but nowhere near enough, and it doesn't actually follow the advice they were given. So 2.5 years after the government said it's a priority, things are not really changing at the rate we need. Education. Where do I start? We have a special education law in Ontario. Do you know when it was passed? 1982. It's a third of a century old. I'll tell you how up to date it is. It says that if you're a parent and you're blind and you need information sent home about your child's special ed needs, they have to send it to you in a format you can read. You know what they say? Braille? That's fine. Large print? Or are you ready for this? This is really modern. Cassette tape.
Oh my gosh.
You can't buy cassette tapes. But that's how out of date they are. Not in my capacity as chair of the AODA Alliance, but I sit on the Toronto District School Board Special Education Advisory Committee, and I got to tell you, we have a lot of work to do. The school system is still full of barriers. So we asked the Ontario government, we said, look, this is a big problem. Under the Disabilities Act, you should create an education accessibility standard that tells school boards what to do. They haven't done it. They haven't agreed to do it. They haven't even agreed that they should do it. And we've been asking for at least 4 years or more. So, and even the standards they have passed, they're not enforcing effectively. They know that a lot of people are breaking the law, and they're doing very little, nowhere near enough to enforce it. So, that's the bad news. Remember I said, bad news, good news, bad news, good news? So I owe you some good news. Good news. Good news is, we're not giving up. Good news is, we are ready for action. Good news is, we are not going to take this lying down. The good news is, we have an agenda for how to get things going and how to make things better. And that's what I want to spend my time with you on now. What can you do? You might think it's a bit of an uphill battle. We're used to uphill battles. 21 years ago, when we started the Accessibility Act movement, you know how many people we got together to start? There were 20 of us. Most people had never heard of the issue. Most people in the disability community had never heard of the issue. People said, there's no way you're going to get people with disabilities to agree to work on this. You're never going to get people with intellectual disabilities and people with mobility disabilities and people with vision disabilities and learning disabilities. You're never going to get them all to agree on an agenda. We did. You're never going to get them to get together and put pressure on the government. We did. You're never going to get political parties to listen to you. We did. When the first government to try to deal with this, the Mike Harris government, came up with a really weak law, they said, you'll never get anybody else to come forward with a stronger law. We did. And it was passed in 2005. We've proved everybody wrong every step of the way. And I want to spend the rest of my time with you now talking about how you can help us win the next round. So, what are the goals? And I'm not talking about stuff that is abstract. I want to talk about things that's going to make a big difference for you specifically. What are our goals? It's a simple one. 2 parts. We want to get the government to enforce the law on accessibility now. They promised they'd effectively enforce it, and they know that there are huge numbers of organizations that aren't complying, and yet they're doing very little to enforce it. The more, and we're not saying that, you send in enforcement the very first day. You give people time to comply, but they've given them 10 years, up to 10 years. There comes a time when you got to say to organizations, if you're not going to comply, we're going to impose orders and we're going to levy monetary penalties. Think about it this way, folks. Can you imagine what speed people would drive on the 401 if they knew that police never police the 401? They'd drive at whatever speed they want. If the police announce, we're out there, and they patrol and they pull people over who are speeding, people obey the law. Same for the AODA. The second thing we want, so our first goal is, could you please effectively enforce the law? The second thing we want them to do is we want them to create new access standards to address the barriers they haven't fixed. And a huge priority in that area is education. We want an education accessibility standard. We think people, and by the way, that's for not just for schools. Schools are important, colleges, job training programs, anything where you get a chance to learn could be covered by this. So what do? Well, I'm going to suggest to you a couple of strategies that relate to this, but you could also use this in any advocacy work that you are involved in with individuals with intellectual disabilities that come in contact with you as part of your work. So I'm going to talk about it for AODA advocacy, but you could do the same thing for any issue you're dealing with. I'm going to tell you about two of the most important weapons you have. And when I say weapons, I only mean legal stuff, not violence. One's your mouth, and the other is if you have a smartphone. That's all you need. Let me talk to you first about your mouth. We need to get as many people as possible to contact their member of the Ontario legislature and sit down with them and simply say, you're not doing a good job on the Disabilities Act. I'm still facing barriers. And the way to do that is both working with the individuals with your organization, the consumers you work with, training them to do it, going with them. And you might say, wow, what, are we supposed to go in there and talk about the legislation and get into all this legal stuff? No, I don't expect that. But I don't think that matters. Anybody who's interested in that stuff, we're happy to talk to you about it and suggest things you could say. But the message is a simple one. We were promised a fully accessible Ontario. We still face barriers. We need Ontario to do a better job. We need the law enforced, and we need new rules for access in areas like education. That's the whole message. And the most powerful thing in the office of a member of the legislature, when sitting, whether it's one of you as a professional or an individual with an intellectual disability, or the two of you together, the most powerful thing is not fancy arguments about this word or that word in a regulation or any of that kind of legal stuff. It's stories. Stories about the actual barriers people face. Do you know how many people kids there are receiving or designated as special education students in the Toronto District School Board? 43,000 out of 240,000 students, or 1 in 6. Now, assuming each of them has at least one parent. Some have one parent, some have two. That's a lot of people with a lot of stories, including people with intellectual disabilities, with dual diagnoses, and so on. Those stories of barriers prove why we need an education accessibility standard. Those stories about barriers show why we're not doing enough for employment for people with all kinds of disabilities, including intellectual disabilities. If you can just go to visit with a member of the legislature, one-on-one, or get your consumers to go, or train their families to go with them, the more that go, the better we'll do. Let me explain something to you. I told you that 21 years ago we started this movement. We spent 10 years fighting for the Disabilities Act that didn't suddenly materialize. And we had to do exactly what I just said. We had to go lobby these members of the legislature one at a time. It meant going to their offices. It meant you don't first get to meet them. You got to talk to their staff and tell them your stories and then set up a meeting. And we convinced them one at a time. So much so that the day that the AODA was voted on in the legislature in May of 2005, 10 years ago, I was there. It was an amazing day. That law passed unanimously. All three parties. And they all stood up and they all applauded with real excitement. There was a sense they were making history. I don't know how much you follow politics, but there are very few days when the New Democrats, conservatives, and liberals agree on anything, much less stand up and cheer together when they do something together. It happened that day. So what's the problem? 10 years have gone by, and many, in fact, I think a majority of the members of the legislature who were there when we fought for this law have left politics, and they've been replaced. Now, I'm not saying the people who replaced them were probably bad people or something, but they weren't there during the fight. They don't have fire in their belly about this. They don't have a sense that we were making history. They don't have a sense that there's a mission that's not being accomplished. We need you to get them excited. We need you to get them to have fire in their belly. And by the way, we're nonpartisan. We want to reach New Democrats, we want to reach liberals, and we want to reach conservatives. We need them all. If they're opposition members, they can stand up in the legislature and demand, we need more. If they're government members, they can go to their own premier in private meetings and say, we need more. We produced an action kit. It's on our website a year ago, aodaalliance.org. It's right up there. And we're going to have new action tips out, over the next weeks. But we need you to get individuals and with intellectual disabilities and their families to go and meet with their member of the legislature. And they should tell their own stories. And the final part of the meeting is, we need the Disabilities Act enforced. We need an education standard. We need action now. We need the government to take this issue far more seriously than they are. And your weapon, parents, family members, individuals with intellectual disabilities, their weapon is their mouth. We all come with one. And if they have a speech limitation, we have other ways of communicating, but one way or other, that's what we got to do. But I said there's a second weapon, and that's the smartphone. You might think, well, who am I supposed to phone? No, that's not it. Every smartphone comes with a video camera. And 25, 30 years ago, if we wanted to get something in the news, we had to call a newspaper, call a TV station, send a photographer, send a camera person. Of course, most of the time they don't come. We don't have to do that anymore. You experience a barrier, take out your smartphone and take a picture or a video. It's free. Post it on YouTube. We use Twitter or Facebook to spread the word. Let me tell you a couple of stories. And by the way, this is where we become our own journalists, and we then spread the word, and these stories get picked up by the newspaper. And you can send these videos to your member of the legislature too. Let me give you, can I just tell you 2 stories? These are wonderful. I love these. And these are stories that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And the only reason they happen is because of a smartphone. Now, you know, people with mobility disabilities, they need disability parking spots, and often there are people who park in them who don't have a disability, and the law isn't enforced very well. Now, if I called up the Toronto Star and said, here's a news story, people without disabilities park in disability spots, they'd say, that's not news. And if I said, oh, but there's a guy out in front right now parked in a handicapped spot, he doesn't have a disability. Well, how do we know? We're not going to send a reporter over for that. You'd never get coverage. Think again. I got a call a couple years ago from the London Free Press. They had a picture. Somebody took a picture and sent it to them, and they wanted to write a story about it. It was about somebody without a disability parked in a disability spot. Ready for this? It was a police car.
Ooh.
Parked in front of a donut store.
Oh, no way.
And I don't think they were investigating stolen donuts. We connected them up with a spokesperson for Spinal Cord Injury Ontario. The story ran. Just took a picture. They didn't have to go anywhere. You take a picture, you can email it to the newsroom, off you go. Here's another story. So there's a dad who lives in Guelph. And he has a daughter who's about 8 years old who has cerebral palsy. Now, these aren't intellectual disability stories, but you can do the exact same stuff with intellectual disability barriers. So this dad wanted to take his daughter to a fun zone, one of those you pay to go and let the kids play. Daughter loves it. Normally the rule is you can't wear shoes. She has these special orthopedic shoes. She has cerebral palsy, and she has to have these shoes to be able to walk. Well, she'd been there before, no problem. They went one day, and they were told you can't come in because you can't use those shoes. The child was devastated. The dad was terribly upset. They put this story up on their Facebook page. It went viral, and what do you know? It ends up in the Guelph Mercury. Not because a reporter went out and covered it first, but first they put it up on Facebook and the word spread. Now, if it had been me, or you after this training, what I would do, as soon as it starts happening, is I would take out my smartphone and I'd hold it up and say, now I'm just turning on my video camera. Today is Monday, November 23rd, and we're at the David Lepofsky's Fun Zone. Could you just say your name again, because I'm videoing you? And would you just repeat that you won't let a child with cerebral palsy come in here and wear her orthopedic shoes that she's always worn in the past? Can you just say, and can I get your name, please? Now, they're going to do either of two things. They're going to change their mind and let the child in, in which case we've overcome the barrier. Or they're not going to change their mind and you've got a video. And all of a sudden, it's like that photograph of the police car in front of the donut store. You got everything you need. So what we need is for you and for families and individuals with disabilities to start spreading the word about the barriers they face using these kind of videos. They don't have to be fancy. I have no trouble as a blind person. I know how to record a video. My aim isn't very good, but I can still do it well enough to get what I need. You can do it too. So mouth and smartphone. That's all we need. Let me conclude by telling you that through our AODA updates, we're going to be spreading the word over the next weeks about more issues and more actions that can be taken. But nothing is going to change unless more and more people go to their members of the legislature, and then when those members of the legislature get together for lunch or coffee and they start telling stories about, I had somebody approach me about this issue, and somebody else says, I had somebody too. Oh, you heard it in your community. So did I. And it's all about accessibility for people with disabilities. Then things will change. That's how we won this law, and that's how we're going to get it back on the rails. So I want to thank you all for this opportunity to talk to you.